why we love the Tang Dynasty, exploring the history and charm of what's seen as one of the greatest imperial dynasties in Chinese history. Episode 18 – Portraits of Landscapes. In this episode, we're surveying the landscape of the Tang Dynasty to discover how its artists charted the changes that they saw about them. I'm Bob Jones, and in this podcast series we're getting to know the Tang Dynasty and attempting to discover how, at its height, it was possibly the most prosperous, interconnected and innovative country in the world with a rich and influential legacy that survives to this day. Clearly, landscapes were nothing new to the Tang Dynasty. For many centuries, painters have been including elements of landscapes in their work, but mainly as backgrounds or as part of murals. But the focus tended to be on the details: people, events, battles, possessions, drama, and action. But during the Tang Dynasty, landscape painting, putting the vista, the panorama, the view center stage, stepped out from the shadows and became a thing in its own right. But why did this happen? There were several reasons. One was the influence of Buddhist paintings. As far back as the 5th century, you could find painters who blended famous temples and significant mountains with the natural scenery that surrounded them. But the surroundings were incidental and vague. Nevertheless, some believed they were important. Zhong Bing, for example, who lived in the 4th century, so not too long before the Tang, was a Chinese artist and musician. He was a Buddhist and a hermit and travelled all his life. He also wrote the earliest text on landscape painting. In it he wrote, "Landscapes have a material existence and yet reach us also in a spiritual domain." Inevitably, Taoism was also to have an effect on Tang landscape painting, reflecting the teachings of Lao Tzu, who promoted living simply and honestly and in harmony with nature. Taoist artists painted landscapes which depicted the virtues of the natural world as examples for men. Chapter 64 of the Tao De Jing, The Works of Lao Tzu, contains a passage which is known around the world. A tree with the girth of a man's embrace grows out of a tiny shoot. A terrace 9 stories high rises from a basket of dirt. The journey of 1,000 li begins under your feet. There were, of course, various strands or schools of landscape painting in the Tang Dynasty. One was exemplified by a painter called Li Cixun. Although he wouldn't have known it at the time, he now is seen as the chief exponent of the decoratively coloured, lush landscape style. He was related to the Tang imperial family and led an active political life and held an honorary title of general. His son, Li Jiaodao, was also a famous painter. Sometimes they are referred to as Big General Li and Little General Li. They are known to have painted highly decorative, meticulous works, using especially mineral colours, blues and greens, and whites and gold. Their works were different from the mainstream of landscape paintings created by the literati up until then, and would often reflect the colours of the changing seasons. Such landscape paintings were fulfilling a need in the people of the Tang, who were increasingly in search perhaps of profundity in life. How do you express spirituality in art? Portrait paintings were never going to be able to achieve this. They needed a style that showed the wonder of the world, in perfect perspective, the beauty of depth and space. In contrast, there is the work of painter Wu Daozi. He lost both his parents at a young age and lived a hard life in his early years. He learned his trade from folk artists and sculptors and had earned a good reputation for himself by the age of 20. He was invited by Emperor Xuanzong to be an imperial painter at court. As such, he could only paint at the emperor's request, which was highly restricting. However, he always drank while he painted, which liberated his creativity somewhat. There are tales that he would draw crowds when he painted for his brash speed and ability to broad brush paint without sketching first. He mainly painted religious murals. It suggested around 300 murals and 100 scrolls. He drew mountains, rivers, flowers, and birds. Wu Daozi is regarded as one of the finest painters of the Tang Dynasty and skilled at both drawing figures but also landscapes. He was an all-round painter. Wang Wei developed yet another style. We've met him before as a famous poet, but in his later years he lived in seclusion in Lantian County, Shaanxi Province. His style is described as humanistic and rooted in the real world. Wang's art can only be reconstructed theoretically on the basis of contemporary records and surviving copies of his paintings. He is best known for ink monochrome landscapes, especially snowscapes. The latter demanded the use of an ink wash technique. Wang Wei's paintings were both innovative and traditional, but certainly it was his combination of masterful painting and poetic skills that brought about his almost mythical status in later ages. It may or may not be relevant to say that many of these painters chose at some point in their lives to paint in seclusion. Some have suggested that it could have been for religious reasons. Wang Wei's mother, for example, was a Buddhist. Did he choose isolation as a meditative technique? Others say that they were escaping the strictness of society and the imperial court especially, particularly if they were exiled for bad behavior. Seclusion and isolation tended to mean that you had to retreat to the countryside. Not an easy place to consider painting figures, if indeed you could find people to paint, but a perfect place to paint shan shui, mountains and rivers. Some Tang painters were moved to paint by the things they saw in the course of their daily work. Han Huang, for example, was a prime minister during the reign of Emperor Dezong. He often went to the countryside to investigate social conditions and incorporated his attention to agriculture and his sympathy for farmers into his painting works during his long-term administration of local work. His landscapes are regarded as masterpieces of rural life. Many of his works were discovered in the tomb of a prince. His paintings show a light touch, mainly ink and wash landscape painting, the most unique of which is the painting of a sun. There is another reason why landscape paintings took off in the Tang Dynasty, and that is the Tang nobility's love of architecture. They loved cities, palaces and pavilions. They all had a lot of white walls which needed to be filled with something. Why not a landscape painting? Temple walls were mainly covered by paintings on the subject of Buddhism and Taoism, but the general decoration for houses was mainly landscapes and flowers and birds. The landscape paintings were influenced heavily by landscape poetry, and because poets were often painters and calligraphers, the poetry was likewise influenced by the landscapes they increasingly saw all about them. How do we know this? Because academics have examined the words used in poetry at the time and have discovered that the poems of Li Bai and Du Fu have a large number of colours mentioned within them, the greens, the reds, that were popular in landscape paintings. This was an entirely natural for the Tang pursuit of poetry in painting and painting in poetry. The key take-home from this podcast is perhaps the realization that landscape painting in the Tang Dynasty was stepping out of the shadows after years as the handmaiden to figurative painting, and as something to cover up a blank wall in a temple or tomb. It was becoming an art form in its own right. It was no longer an adjunct to poetry, it was in partnership with it. And there was not one, but three distinct traditions. A lush landscape tradition, an ink and wash style, and a lightly coloured, gentle form. Of the three, ink landscapes were to emerge as the mainstream of Chinese landscape painting and would become the principal way for the literati to express their emotions and thoughts. Special thanks go out to San Lian Zhongdu for their help in creating the content for this show. This is Bob Jones. Thanks for listening. Join me again next time.